It's about 5 years since I started to take a serious interest in FSX, and partly it was a result of having discovered Orbx. I remember a couple of videos by David Rogers flying out of little OZx strips, and it was so different to the default FSX scenery that I was instantly hooked. And so I built myself a PC and started with the AU Blue demo and the free OZx 1.0 strips, followed shortly by the other Orbx Australia regions. It took me a while to understand what I was buying. Orbx does, broadly speaking, two different kinds of products. That's photorealistic airports and land class based regions. The latter originally covered Australia, but since then they've added lots of stuff covering North America, New Zealand and Europe. Anyway, I soon discovered that navigating between airports wasn't quite what I'd expected because it didn't match my maps. The roads and rivers seemed to be in the right places, but nothing else looked right. Or rather, it looked right, but it wasn't. And of course now I realise that's the nature of land class scenery, which is made up of a limited number of generic scenery tiles that get reused anywhere there's similar terrain. So if you're flying in a region where you'd expect to see farmland, for example, you'll see tiles showing generic farmland. Of course, Orbx land class textures are enormously better quality than the default ones, and they're largely photorealistic, created from actual aerial photography and with autogen objects such as trees and buildings placed individually by hand. But land class based scenery is a compromise, so it doesn't match your maps, and if you fly long VFRs you're likely to see tiles repeating. The real pleasure's flying between airports, of course, and this brings us to the second kind of scenery, broadly speaking, Orbx makes, which is photoreal airports. These are typically modelled along with a generous helping of the airport vicinity, and they are almost without exception works of art. But it's an expensive way to buy scenery, which reflects the amount of work involved in creating each airport. By contrast, flying into default FSX airports is a miserable experience. Now, I have to say that's changed somewhat with all the regions Orbx has produced since Australia, and they've provided, to date at least, upgraded versions of the default airports with the scenery regions. Of course, these are still nothing like the payware airports, but it's a big improvement over default. Orbx also offers a fistful of freeware airports, and these are by and large done to the same standard as their payware. But the other wildcard is OZx, and this is why I would always recommend the Australia regions to someone who's new to Orbx. OZx has its roots in the same freeware community as Orbx, and many of the developers have a foot in both camps. In fact, it's probably more helpful to talk about the freeware scenery community than strictly OZx, as there was something of a ruckus a couple of years ago over intellectual property, and some developers have chosen to distinguish themselves from OZx. Politics aside, the legacy these guys have left is an absolute goldmine. OZx 3.4 is the latest version at the time of writing, and it contains something like 340 airports, and with more being released individually all the time. Anthony Lynch also deserves a special mention with more than 30 strips free in his Ants Aussie Airports pack. What I love about the freeware strips is that many of these are tiny farms and bush strips, which is exactly the sort of flying I like to do. Orbx's newer airports for its North American, New Zealand and European regions continue to push the limits of what can be done with FSX, but they're also increasingly resource hungry, and performance can be quite disappointing on older hardware, and so it can be a real breath of fresh air to go back to some of those earlier Australian strips. It's also worth noting that while the Australia regions were Orbx's first products, things aren't completely static, and they've just released a major update of the 3D lighting system, which is based on new technology developed for their FS Global product. There's also talk of a complete revamp of Australia at some point, but for now this is a cost-effective way to step your FSX experience up a gear and still by and large maintain excellent performance.